Hello everybody, welcome to the Midnight Storytellers Legacy Project. Make yourselves comfortable, I have a story to tell you. A long way north of where I'm sitting now is the Isle of Barra in the Western Isles of Scotland. They say that the waters around the Isle of Barra are so clear green you can look right down to the ocean floor and count the arms on the starfish. On the rocks around the shores of Barra there grows a grey-green seaweed with a curling golden edge to it. And that seaweed is found nowhere else in the world. There were once two sisters on the Isle of Barra. They shared a croft and they shared the hard work of their lives. One sister was fair, like sunlight in motion. The other sister was dark, dark as a secret, dark as a twist of fate. There weren't a lot of men to marry on the Isle of Barra. There weren't a lot of spare men in the Western Isles. And so it happened that both sisters fell in love with the same young man. And young men being what they are, he either couldn't or wouldn't make up his mind which of the sisters he would choose to marry. Dark was desperately in love with him. Dark would do anything to win this young man. Dark went to see the wise woman of the islands, and she told the wise woman her heart's desire. The wise woman taught Dark a song, and you are very lucky that I don't sing in public. But Dark learnt the song well. And the very next time that the two sisters were down on the shore gathering driftwood for the fire at home, well, it was a long day, and both sisters had big bundles to carry back home, big bundles that they bound together, and both sisters had to clamber over rocks as the tide was on the turn. They were clambering over the rocks and slipping and sliding and trying not to cut their bare feet on the barnacles and trying not to get trapped in the cracks in the rocks. And there was slippery seaweed, which at that time was just the grey-green kind. And halfway across that big patch of rocks, on their way to the end of the beach and the path that went up to the top of the cliff, halfway across that big patch of rocks, there was a little space in among the seaweed. And Dark stopped there and put her bundle down. She said, "I am so tired. I need to rest." And so the two sisters put their bundles down and sat side by side and looked out to the horizon where the sun was setting and sending blood-red ripples all across the sea, almost to the sisters' feet. And as they sat there, Dark began to sing that song she had learnt, a song that twisted and reached and curled around and wrapped its melody around her sister. And Fair settled back and curled herself around and fell asleep there in the middle of the rocks with her golden curling tresses spreading, fanning out around her. And while Dark continued to sing, she reached across and picked up a handful of her sister's golden hair and a long strand of seaweed, and she began to wind them together, and more hair and more pieces of seaweed, binding and twisting and wrapping and knotting, until Dark had completely bound her sister to the rocks. And then Dark stopped singing and stood up. And Fair awoke and couldn't move. She was completely captured, completely tied down to the rocks. And at first, of course, she thought it was the joke. And she laughed up at her sister and then, "Please, set me free. Come on, it's time to go. The tide's coming in." And Dark smiled and turned and walked away off the rocks toward the cliff path. And Fair called out after her sister, and Fair screamed after her sister. And Dark just kept on walking. Up the cliff path she went, up to the top, and set off along the route back to the croft. And who should Dark meet hurrying towards her but the young man of her heart's desire? Dark stopped to greet him. She turned up her face to be kissed, but the young man said, "I have heard the most wonderful singing from somewhere down on the beach. I've got to go and find who it is. My heart has gone to that woman and her singing." And Dark drew breath to explain that it was her song, and the young man pushed straight past her and was on his way to the edge of the cliff, to the path, and on his way down. And a moment later, he'd seen Fair out on the rocks, and a moment after that, he was on his knees beside Fair with his hands plunging into the twists of golden hair and seaweed, and wrenching and pulling and struggling to untie the fair sister. And he was still shouting, and Fair was still screaming and gasping, as the churning grey waves of the incoming tide overwhelmed them both. Dark had watched it all happen from the top of the cliffs. She'd stood with the sea breeze swirling her dark cloak around her, swirling her tresses across her face, her own hair as dark as a secret, as dark as a twist of fate. And as Dark watched the place where her sister and the young man had been, as the waters heaved and swirled at the foot of the cliff, suddenly the heads of two seals bobbed up in the place where her sister and the young man had been. Two seals who swam around each other, who leapt and played together in the waters, who touched noses. Two seals who would be together forever in their love in the waters of the islands. And Dark realized that she had killed the two people she loved most in all the world, and her heart broke inside her. And so Dark took one more step to the edge of the cliff and stepped off. As she plunged down with her black cloak and her near black hair streaming out behind her, Dark's body also transformed. Her neck stretched and elongated, and all the darkness of the cloak and her hair became feathers. And it was a cormorant that dived neatly into the churning waves and bobbed up a moment later and looked around. And it saw the seals and it began to swim after them, trying to reach them, trying to touch them, trying to touch Sorry to her sister and the young man. But the seals were fast, and the seals dived down deep, and Dark the cormorant couldn't catch up with them. And so Dark tried to call after them, tried to call Sorry, but the only sound that would come out of her was a harsh croaking. And so, in the Western Isles of Scotland, they say that is why there is this golden-edged seaweed on the shores of that island. They call it Fair Maiden's Tresses. And they say too, that is why the cormorant's cry is so harsh and sad.